Okay, here's the F800 ready for its valve check. Removing the mirrors first and the screen. Don't actually need the screen removed, but it stops it getting in the way on getting damaged. Then onto the side, onto the center fake tank panel. 8 screws here. Once that's out of the way, remove anything we store underneath there. There's my spare clutch lever and my cable repair kit and a spare set of spark plugs. Speeded this up to double speed, so it's the side panel removal. You'll notice I leave the lower segment of the fairing on for most service work, but when I come back, the screw I'm just undoing now I'll actually replace to hold that panel in place, leaving that one underneath there because that will hold the panel in for now. But actually for the valve check, when we come to put the cam cover back on, it's easier to remove those lower segments, so later on in the work I actually took them off anyway. Okay, here's the airbox. So undoing the clips that hold the snorkel in place. 2 clips, push in, pop up. Out comes the snorkel. At the top we can see that temperature sensor. There's the air filter, which just pops out for cleaning. Remove the battery, both terminals and the bracket. That little white thing is my spare headlamp bulb strapped on to that starter motor relay. 4 bolts that hold the airbox in. I've already removed the loom that goes to the temperature sensor at the top and the solenoid on the right hand side, that's the breather for the crankcase, and unclipped those wires from the airbox so they're hanging free. And in a minute you'll see I'll remove the starter solenoid assembly, which is the black blob on the front of the airbox. It just slides at the bottom towards the back of the bike, and then the top will lift up and the whole lot will lift out one way. No need to undo any of the wires or anything. The front ABS connector and wire get in the way down here. They normally live on top of the battery, but when I reassembled mine I found there was room to tuck them down in front of the battery out of the way. So the whole thing pops off of the throttle bodies, and under here we can see the normal idle bypass hoses, and notice how they're already kinking at the bottom because I've lifted them, and this is exactly what happens to them when they get very hot when you're riding. There's the actuator, the plug that holds it on. That obviously needs unplugging, as do both the hoses. They just pull off. Yep, see the kinking in there. Okay, pull the 2 hoses off, unplug the plug to the actuator. That's the bottom of the airbox almost free. I'm undoing the pipe for the crankcase breather the other side. It's a round plastic clip you press in and pops off. Need to get that starter loom out of the way, so slide the bottom towards the back of the bike and then lift the whole thing up and off it pops. And now we should just have 1 hose at the bottom, another crankcase breather hose. Pair of mole grips, squeeze it in, pop it down, and off comes the airbox complete. Okay, we can now see inside the top of the engine. There's the throttle cable and the cam that opens the butterflies. Here's the fuel line sensor. The switch before that was the throttle position, so that's the pressure sensor for the fuel. There's the 2 injectors and their plugs. Both of these will need to come off. HT feeds, and again both those plugs will need to come off and they'll need to be pulled out. And down here is the oil pressure switch, easier to access underneath, and temperature. So there's engine temperature and oil pressure under there, and that big nut on the end there, not very in focus, is the cam tensioner. So that nut comes off to replace the spring to get rid of that horrible rattle at startup. Stuff a bit of rag down the carb body so we don't drop anything in there, but we do have to remember to take them off before we put the whole thing back together again. I've already pulled the plugs off the HT leads because I'm doing all this one-handed because I'm holding the camera. A bit of WD-40 around the tops of the HT caps, soaks down inside and makes them much easier to pull out, and then you don't need the expensive BMW plug removal tool. There's one. There's two. Make sure you don't drop them. They're quite brittle and they'll crack, and then you'll get leaks. HT spark leaks. Bit of rag down each one of these. Again, the plugs are a long way down, and if we drop any nuts or bolts, they're going to be difficult to get off. Undo the throttle cable, because that's going over the top of the cam cover. Little wheel that undoes. Unclip the cable, and then hook the whole thing round, and unhook it off the end. Again, not easy to do one-handed. And then I'll pull that throttle cable all the way through. Undo the 4 bolts that hold in the top, and they've got washers underneath which should be replaced. Rubber bushes, seals. Injector plugs unplugged, and the other one. And then that whole loom, in fact, I pulled it back even further later on, can be threaded out of the way. I just tucked it out of the way here, but before I put the cam cover back on, I pulled the whole lot right back. Now I'm going to unclip the throttle cable and actually get it right out of the way, because I've decided that it's just going to get in the way of that cam cover. And by pulling it back, I can retract it all the way to in front of the cam cover and just leave the end sticking out so that I can pull it back later on. Spin the little lock nut on it so it doesn't drop off and get lost anywhere. That's it, tucked out of the way. Now time to get the clutch cable out of the way, because again that goes across the top of the cam cover. Undo the little tag. You may not have had that tag bent down. I do, to prevent the cable popping off. 1/2 inch spanner. Undo the 2 nuts. Spin the bottom nut off so I don't lose my adjustment position on it. And then I can pull the cable, take the tension, let the cable go, and all being well I should be able to hook that off. There it goes. And I've pulled the clutch cable right up and tucked it out of the way, but later on I'll actually retract it all the way back in before I put the cam cover back on. Now we lift the cam cover out of the way. There it comes. There's the old gasket, which I've retained, but probably won't be ever used again. Loads of sealer on it all over the place. And that all has to be cleaned off, of both the engine casing and the cam cover itself. So you've got to be really scrupulously clean here. Clean all the old gasket off and then give it a good wipe round. Make sure there's no residues of oil. And there's also a gasket that goes in there. You just saw him remove it, but around the spark plug holes, and that's replaced as well. So in here we've got the cams. There's the spark plugs down that hole. There's my cam. A little bit of wear, but nothing too bad for nearly 50,000 miles. The gear on the end there drives the water pump. And there's also on that right hand side the cam sensor position, cam chain down there. And then the valves either side. There's the cam sensor position. That plug I unplugged and tucked out the way as well, so when I put the cam cover back on I could get rid of it. And here's all the gasket we need to remove. So all has to be pulled off. Here's the check. I've already spun it round for top dead center, so I can do 2 of these. There's one, there's the other. Using the feeler gauges, keep working up through the thicknesses until it won't go in, and then 1 down from that is the size. Just nudging the back wheel round, even with the spark plugs in 6th gear, lets me move the cams round so I can check the exhaust as well. Make a note of all the sizes. These are in thousandths of an inch, not metric, but I check the conversions and that's fine. This is the corner that leaks on the cam cover, this front corner, so that particularly needs to be checked. I did this at the end of the job to put the cover back in, removing the radiator. That 1 bolt to undo, and then there's 3 pivot points. 1, 2 and 3 at the top there, and the whole radiator gets pushed over to the other side like that, and the radiator will just drop off. At this stage I've already cut the bolt at the bottom that holds the radiator, the fan guard in place, because it was seized solid, so that's going to be replaced with a nut and bolt later. There's the rad out the way. That fan cover has already been removed and taken to one side. There's the fan protector, and one last look at the engine, all complete. There we go.